This is the last section that we're going to be talking about the muscular system. In this section, we're going to be talking about the muscle movements. To start out, I want to look at these 5 rules of skeletal muscle activity. These are some rules that hold true about all skeletal muscles. And so let's go through them here. So, skeletal muscles cross a joint. This means that the muscle is attached on one side of the joint, crosses that joint, and attaches on the other side of the joint. This is what allows the muscles to move. So if the muscle was all on one side of the joint, it wouldn't be able to create any movements. But by it being attached on both sides of that joint, as the muscle contracts and shortens, that's going to pull the joint and cause movement to happen. In general, most of the muscle is on the proximal side of the joint. So if you remember proximal, that means closer to the body. And so, for example, if you think about the biceps, we'll look at a picture here in a minute and go through all these rules again, but if you think about the biceps, the majority of the biceps, the mass of that muscle is proximal to the elbow. So it's closer to the body. The elbow is distal. There's what's called an origin and an insertion. This is talking about the muscle and where it attaches. Here's one that you're probably familiar with. Skeletal muscles pull, they do not push. So if you flex your arm and your biceps contract, in order to straighten your arm, your biceps don't have anything to do with that. They can't push your arm back. You have to have a muscle on the other side that's going to pull that arm straight. And then finally, when you have a muscle contraction, the insertion moves towards the origin. So let's look at a picture here and go through these and see exactly what these mean. So the first one here, so our first rule said that the skeletal muscle is going to cross the joint. In this case, here is our joint, our elbow joint here, and here's our muscle. Notice that on this side it's attached. This is called the origin. And then it comes across that joint, and this is where we have the insertion. Here's the majority of the muscle, the bulk of the muscle. Notice that it's proximal. So this is our proximal end of the bone, and here's distal end. So the majority of the muscle is on the proximal side of this joint. The insertion, this is where it inserts on the bone that is going to move. So the origin is the bone that is held stationary. So when you flex your bicep, you are not moving your upper arm, you're just moving your forearm, and it's being pulled towards that origin. So when the muscle contracts, the insertion, this muscle is going to shorten, the insertion is pulled towards the origin, and that causes the movement. Notice that this muscle, the bicep, can only pull in this direction. It is never going to push. That has to be another muscle. That has to be your triceps, in this case, would be pulling that arm straight again. Okay, so again, number 1, all skeletal muscles cross a joint. You can see crossing a joint here. The bulk of the muscle is on the proximal side. They have 2 attachments, at least 2 attachments. In this case, you have the origin and the insertion. In the case of the bicep, because it's called a bicep because it has 2 origins where it attaches, and so we call it the bicep. And then tricep has 3. And then it can only pull, it can only shorten, it can't push. And then finally, the insertion is going to move towards the origin. And there you have the rules to remember when you're talking about skeletal muscles. So because skeletal muscles can only push, they can only pull, they can't push. Only pull, they do not push. They have to come in pairs. And so we have different muscles. We give some different names to the different types of muscles according to what they do. First of all, we have what's called the prime mover. And when you're thinking about muscle movement, usually what we think of is what we would call the prime mover. So the prime mover is the muscle that is causing the movement to happen. So we've been talking a lot about, I've always been using the bicep as an example, so let's keep working with that. So in the case of when you are moving your forearm towards your upper arm, when you're moving that elbow joint, your prime mover is your bicep. That's what's causing this certain movement. Your antagonist is going to be the muscle that works against the bicep. So in the case of the flexion of your elbow, that is going to be your triceps, because it's working again. It can reverse what's happening with the prime mover. We have something called the synergist. The synergist is kind of the helper muscle. It's not the main muscle in that movement, but it helps that muscle stabilize and be able to carry out its action, or able to even help it carry out that contraction or that movement. And finally, we have what's called a fixator. And the fixator stabilizes the joint so that things aren't moving around when the prime mover is moving. So fixators, for example, the muscles of your back that help you keep a certain posture, those would be fixator muscles. They're holding everything stable, so that as you move or you're running, your back's not going all different ways. It's held in a certain position. This is also important. The synergist is also important because often we have muscles that are going to cross more than one joint. And so if you want to create a movement, you only want to move in a certain direction. You don't want all the joints to move. So the synergist would be a muscle that when the prime mover is moving, it can help make sure that only the joint that you want to move is what is being moved. So these are just some names we give to the different types of muscles. Now we want to look at some different types of muscle movements. Here's the first few. So when we move, we have names for the movements that are done, so everybody knows what you're talking about. So these words we're going to go over now, whenever you say these words, they have a certain meaning. So first of all, we have what's called flexion. Flexion is going to be a movement that decreases the angle of a joint. So for example, in this picture here, she's lifting her leg. Originally, the leg was straight, and as she moved it, now it's here. So our first angle was a 180 degree angle, but then after she moved it, now our angle is shorter. It's a smaller angle. It's just a 90 degree angle. So we've decreased that angle. That's a flexion. Same thing with the arm here. So originally when her arm was at her side, here was the angle, but now we've decreased that angle here. Not quite 90 degree angle, but we've decreased that angle. That's what's known as flexion. The opposite of flexion is extension. So extension is going to increase that angle. It's going to move it back to its original spot. So in this case, she's straightening her leg, or she's moving her arm backwards. So you're increasing the angle in an extension situation. So you have flexion, you have extension. So these movements come in pairs. We can also look at this with our head. So if you were to lean your head forward, that'd be a flexion. You're flexing that. You're decreasing. So here's our angle. Now it's here. We've decreased that angle. Extension goes the opposite, increasing that angle. And then you can have something called hyperextension, and that's going beyond. So she's moving her head clear back beyond that resting position, beyond the 180 degree angle. We'd call that hyperextension. The next type of movement is called rotation, and this is, well, I guess I should mention flexion and extension. Those happen in often in hinge joints, like our knee, our elbow, things like that. Rotation is going to be a ball and socket joint. So it's rotating around this joint. So think about rotating your head. That's a rotation. It makes sense, right? And you can also do this with your leg. So a kind of a round movement, circular motion. So rotation just has the one, it doesn't have a partner word. But here's another couple that do. So this is abduction and adduction. So abduction means that you're moving a limb away from the midline of the body. So here's our midline. If we draw a line straight down through this lady here, as you're moving away from that midline, we call that abduction. If you're moving back towards that midline, that's adduction. We also have what's called circumduction. And it's a combination of a lot of movements. It's a combination of a flexion and extension, abduction and adduction. And this is where you're moving your hand in a circle. So if you put your hand out to the side and move that hand in a circular motion, that'd be circumduction. So circum meaning that circular movement. So you have abduction, adduction, and circumduction. Finally, we have what are termed special movements. And these are special movements because they only happen a few places in our body, and so they're not some of these general movements that we just talked about. We have what's called dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So dorsiflexion, as you can see here, means that the foot is moving closer to the shin. That's called a dorsiflexion. So this angle here is decreasing. If you go in the other direction, you have a plantar, so plantar, the bottom of your foot, flexion. So you're increasing that. You're flexing that joint there. Next we have what's called inversion and eversion. So inversion, if you take your foot and roll it towards the middle, that's an inversion. If you roll it the other way, that's an eversion. This is just so you can see some of these special movements have to do with the feet, but then also we have some with the forearm as well. We have supination and pronation. And this is a special movement that happens in your forearm, because what you're able to do is you're able to twist your forearm, but it's not, your elbow's not a ball and socket joint, so it's not like your shoulder where you can move in a circular motion. This is a special joint where the ulna and the radius, those two bones, are rotating over the top of each other, and that allows you to turn your hand over or turn it. So supination, this happens when you are rotating your forearm so that your palm is facing up or is facing out, and this causes your radius and your ulna to be next to each other, so they're not crossing over each other at this point. Way to remember this is like you're holding a bowl of soup. So your hand's going to be up, facing up, and your forearm back here. These are your fingers, and it's like you're holding a cup of soup here. Supination. Pronation is when you flip that hand over. So the back of your hand is going to be facing forward or facing up, and this is going to cause your radius and ulna to cross each other. This is a weaker position than when your radius and ulna are next to each other. They're parallel with each other. And something to think about here is if you were to fall. So people often break their wrist or break their forearm when they fall. When you fall and you put your hands out to catch yourself, your hands are in that pronation position. They're not in supination. And so when you're in pronation, because your radius and ulna are across, that's not as strong. And so when you hit that impact, you're more likely to break that forearm. If you were to hold your hands in a supination, supine, I guess is the way you'd say that, in supine position, as you fell, your radius and ulna, because they're parallel, they'd be better able to take that impact. But of course, that's an awkward way to fall. Nobody falls that way. And so we kind of have to deal with this problem with breaking wrists and things like that. So finally, the last special movement is called opposition. And this is a special movement when you bring your thumb and your finger together. And this is a special human feature that is not found really in the animal kingdom, because of the joints of our hand, the way it's set up, we were able to bring our thumb up and touch each of our fingers. This is called opposition. So this allows us to grasp things, to do very fine motor movements. And so that is one of the characteristics of our skeletal muscle system. Those are the movements of of the muscle system, and that is basically all we're going to talk about in the lecture portion of this class. There's also some lab material as well where you'll be learning the names of muscles and how to name muscles and the different muscles in the body that you're going to need to learn for this course.